everybody. Welcome back to Safest Family on the Block, where knowledge is power. I'm your host, Jason, and I am welcoming back Josh Burmeister, who I tried to call Chris again. I don't know why. You're not named Chris. You're named Josh. Some guy named Chris introduced us, but it's weird. Anyway, Josh Burmeister spent nearly 10 years in the U.S. Navy, finished his career as the chief SEER instructor. He was responsible for leading multiple high-risk Department of Defense training courses. He was CEO of a Fort Bragg-based company that facilitated the training of over 4,000 students in firearms tactics, trauma medicine, and combatives. His security experience ranges from numerous deployments to hostile environments to protecting ultra-high net worth individuals domestically and abroad. Most recently, he has consulted for government contracting, healthcare, and commercial corporations, assisting in security, training, operations, and human performance. He should really have his own TV show about survival and safety, but we're bringing him onto mine. And
no, I'd rather be here. That's fine. I'd rather be right here.
And Josh came on before to talk about how to prepare for emergencies as a family, and he's back. That time we talked about stuff you should have, and this time he's coming on to generously talk to us about stuff we should know, what skill sets we need for survival and emergency management. So thank you so much for coming on today, Josh. And you sent me a list starting with medical knowledge.
Yeah, so I wanted to first talk about just how we thought about this, and this is not all encompassing. This is painting with very broad strokes, and there's different levels of fidelity that we could attack each one of these. But I wanted to have at least something that we would discuss, because I think all of these pay dividends in regular life, and if things go sideways. So medical.
Yeah, and that's important. My family just had an experience with that recently. Somebody put a broken mason jar in a trash bag.
Ooh.
And then I carried it to the curb and it bounced, and it was, you could see the bone, but would brag a little bit on my oldest son happened to be there, and he had a trauma pad and Coban wrap on me before I was done swearing. And we were in the car on the way to the ER in less than 5 minutes. And I think that's the kind of medical training and equipment and knowledge I think we all have, and we kind of don't think about.
Yeah, I think that at multiple levels we can attack medicine and what maybe those different roles are. Just as simple as a CPR class, AED class, those are wonderful. Stop the bleed classes are great. And part of this is not only obviously giving life-saving skills, but also there's a level of inoculation there. There's a lot of people that as soon as they see a cut, see anything that might be a little traumatic, they're out of the fight, as it were, right? I mean, they're just worried about themselves, or they go into shock. So being able to slowly chip away at that, and so where it's just you have a plan, you have the equipment, you have the training, and it can solve everything from little tiny splinters to lacerations from broken mason jars to any further trauma.
And when you mentioned stop the bleed, which was actually a new term to me until you might have mentioned it the last time we talked about, and it's a course, it's a concept. Could you talk a little bit about this? Because I think it's really important. Most parents should take one of these classes.
Yeah, so the Stop the Bleed course, from all the fighting that's gone on over the last 20 years and all of the medical that's come with that, one of the biggest things that we've learned is that everything else is not everything, but most everything else there's some time, but bleeding is the thing that's going to kill you the fastest, and it can happen just as you said. It can be a small nick. And it applies to every demographic, whether you be a hunter, kids doing crafts, it doesn't matter. There's always potential for it. So Stop the Bleed is a reasonably short course. You can get a Stop the Bleed certification, I believe, in a day. And it's essentially just shows you how to stop arterial bleeds specifically, because those are the ones that are going to be to drain you out the fastest. And it talks about sweeps and just different ways to go. And in most of them, there's a small bit of hands-on training, which is always my favorite. I don't like things that are just a PowerPoint or something like that. I like when you can actually practice it a bit.
Excellent. And what are some of the best sources for medical training that your average parent, soccer mom, minivan dad could get?
Sure. So you can always start with the American Red Cross, and that's always a good place to start. There are several other ones. One of my favorite companies, they are a producer, but they're huge in the pushing training out, is a company called North American Rescue, and they tend to have their fingers in some of the very best medical stuff that's out there. but I would have anybody just do a local search. And typically if they are a Stop the Bleed certified, and there's other follow-on courses, there's TCCC, and now there's TCCC for civilians. You can go as far as to get your EMT, paramedic, those kinds of things. But the American Red Cross is a good place to start, and then just do the search for Stop the Bleed in your local area, and typically you'll find some classes.
Excellent. And so, yeah, what else should parents know about preparing themselves, with medical knowledge? We're not all going to go get to be a nurse or an EMT, but
Sure,
we should have more knowledge, I think, also than the, your local Red Cross, day-long course.
Yeah. So there's other medical courses that are out there. And again, I'm not a medic. I've been very fortunate to have a lot of medical training. So I want to be very cautious when I say these things. That's not truly medical advice from this standpoint. But I do think it's important that we have things to look at that are going to be the largest trauma, meaning the ones that are going to kill you the fastest. So if we can do any kind of massive bleeding, that's a big one. We should be able to trust to treat and diagnose our airway, respiration, circulation, and then any kind of we want to do a head-to-toe assessment and worry about shock and hypothermia. Those are big ones. Those are the ones that I would want to know in that kind of setting. There's always knowing about antibiotics and what treats your child and your family and allergies and all of those things, but that's probably left to somebody with a little bit more training. I do think that having medication for your children is a good idea, and knowing the dosages and how long that those can go on. I mean, I think just having that own kind of internal training for yourself is probably a step ahead in the preparedness direction.
At the very least, when you leave the pharmacy and you have that printed sheet of information about the medication you're going to be giving your kids, read it.
Yeah.
At the very least.
That's a good idea.
Right.
That's a good idea. And know what it's going to react with. That's another good one.
Yeah. A friend of mine who's a pharmacist says her main job is keeping doctors from accidentally killing patients through drug interactions. And as parents, we need to also be a line of defense there. So that's really important. And again, every topic we're going to talk about today could be its own, not just episode, but can be and is its own course you can take at a professional level. But that beginning medical knowledge to fix the boo-boos, keep our family members alive at the very least, the response time for your local ambulance company, and to know about the large medical issues like medication, health, what that rash means, how high a fever you can keep them at home versus rush to the ER, all those little things. And getting a degree of training on that's important. Now, the next thing you, Carrie?
No, go ahead.
Carry on.
Right on.
No, carry on.
So, the only thing I was going to say with the medical piece is training is generally in medical, it specifically comes with certifications, right? And or some kind of level of proficiency. And so I would make sure that anywhere that people are going to go for training, that there should be something that comes with that, right? And it'll allow you to know exactly where you're at in this training world. That's not always the case with some of the other training that we're going to talk about. Some of these are going to have to be creative to get some of that training, but it's still skill sets that I think are valuable for people to attain. Like
makes sense. Like navigation. Yeah.
So here's the thing that I think is getting worse and worse in this world, is that the more that we count on our phones and the sultry voice that's coming out of our phone to tell us where to turn is problematic, because if we take away our phone, we have no idea where we are, and furthermore, no way to find out where we are. And it can be a challenge. And so I would encourage anybody, and we'll talk about a couple different levels of ways that I've tried to impart navigation with my children, as well as to a high fidelity, what navigation can look like. So when I was teaching my children how to drive, simple things that I would consider falling under navigation are things like most roads, north, south, and east, west, are numbered odd and even, right? So if it goes across left to right, generally speaking, it's going to be an even number. And if it goes north and south, probably going to be an odd number, right? Like Highway 95, Highway 90. Okay.
Yeah.
So just that correlation for some people, that's like a mind blower, where they're like, wait, that's a thing. So that's one. Number two, mile markers on highways. So I would teach my daughter as she's looking at the GPS and trying to figure out where she is, knowing that most mile markers go from one border of the state to the other. And so, and there are also the exits, usually, not always, but usually correlate to those mile markers. So if you get pulled over on the side of the road, you should at least, not pulled over, but let's say you have a flat tire or whatever, you have to call a tow truck, or you should be able to at least tell them what direction of the road you're on, what road you're on, and the closest mile marker or exit, and correlating between what your GPS says and what you see in the real world. Those are what I would consider basic land navigation things, let alone just knowing how to read a map, and then going into truly looking at navigating with a topographical map, or and there's a lot of tools these days of how to land nav, and so there's Onyx and Gaia and all these crazy applications that you can use that can give you 3D mapping. But being able to find out where you are, and then kind of either bisection or resection, those kinds of things are important. Knowing how a GPS works and how you can't just follow a little arrow to get you to safety. And there's at a low level, there are lots of different land navigation courses that are out there. There's a lot that you can learn from YouTube if you just type in how to use a topographical map, how to use a compass, what is declination. There's a lot of things out there that will be helpful. And there are some really, really good schools out there too. Most wilderness schools start with some kind of navigation training. You can learn things like your own pace count and using, gridded off maps and what that looks like. So all of those things I think are fundamentally important to have at least a baseline level of training.
Yeah, so even from something as simple as your phone's out of juice to serious situation where you're lost, that ability to find where you are, know where you're going, and the relationship between those two things is something that, as you say, we don't have to know anymore, but we should.
Yeah. And I find it very telling. Most of the work that I do, we go into areas that we don't know initially, or it actually doesn't matter. Anywhere that I go that I'm working, whether it be surveillance or protection, the first thing is area familiarization, meaning get to know where you're at, what the area you're working in, what are some of the natural land features, what are the perimeters of the city, what are the landmarks that I might need to know to ping off of if it's a building where I'm just like, oh, okay, I remember that building, it's always going to be north of me. Those kinds of things, they're built into a lot of the work that I've done. And there's probably a reason. I've been in the bad day business for quite a while. So knowing where you are becomes fundamentally important so that you know how to get out of a bad situation.
And as parents for travel as well, I feel like so important, as you say, familiarizing ourselves with the area, using just Google Maps and Google Earth to check it out even before you go, whether that's international travel or just going to the next state for the wrestling meet. Just getting a little bit of that information and then applying your navigation skills to that can help a lot.
Yeah, I agree. I'm a big fan of the application Waze, and I think it does a really, really good job of routing you around traffic and accidents, construction, things like that. The downside of it is that it has no risk mitigation in it. So it has routed me through some places that were very, very sketchy that I would not want to bring in. So just be mindful of that. Sometimes that little familiar voice in the navigation software might take you somewhere you're not comfortable with.
And that's Waze. It's WAYZ, right? That kind of crowdsourced navigation app.
WAZE.
There it is. Right.
Yeah.
And that one's also
really,
international.
Really handy. It works really, really well for getting you around because it is a social media platform. But again, the idea is that when we start stripping away some of these resources, being able to still continue where you need to get to, know where you are, have a relationship with the city, stay out of bad areas. There's a lot of reasons to just turn off your phone every once in a while or learn to use maps in a different way.
Yeah, I had a rude awakening of that a few years ago. We were in Malaysia, and my cheap local phone, it had a GPS, but it was the location, the locator technology in there, whatever it's called, was accurate to about 100 yards, which is fine on the highway, but when you're trying to navigate through Kuala Lumpur, isn't useful at all.
No, exactly right. Yeah, I mean, if you consider usually you want to be within 1 meter, not necessarily.
Yeah. I mean,
challenge.
that's multiple blocks, right? So it was crazy. But those navigational skills, and as you said, this is a skill set that modern conveniences have made not urgent, even though it's still very important.
Yeah, and I'm not saying you have to always, I'm not saying forego navigation or GPS or your phone altogether. I'm just saying make sure you have a rooted foundation. If that goes away, have some levels of redundancy, and then be able to have some level of just generic land navigation so that you can get out of a tight spot.
Yeah, have that plan B already in place, because you don't want to improvise plan B because you're already having a rough day when you need it.
Already a bad day. That's right.
Yeah. And on the topic of navigation, also you mentioned driving, and I mean, most parents, we can drive, but that's not the same thing as what you're talking about, I suspect.
Yeah, this is a tough one because anybody that's my age, you've been driving 30 plus years. Well, I've only had 2 accidents. I'm a good driver. And then you take a driving course or 2, and then you're like, wow, I really don't want to be on the roads with any of these people ever again. Driving, the reason I really like to focus on driving is because we all inherently use it in our lives so much. And although there are a ton of safety functions built into automobiles, and more every year we see new releases of cars, it's still inherently dangerous. And so to me, it's a twofer. It's like, it doesn't not just prepare you in a time where you might need it under austere conditions, but it's your day-to-day life that it makes an impact as well. So even a very basic, just a simple 1-day defensive driving course will show you about apexes of turns and tell you about vehicle dynamics, how important tires are, braking, threshold braking, all of those kinds of things. If those terms didn't sound familiar to you and you still consider yourself a good driver, it might be a reason to go out and at least take a 1-day class. The downside to most driver training is that once you get past some basic training, it can get expensive because you're doing a lot of damage to cars. And so the cost goes up just because you're utilizing those resources. But also, some of the most fun training I've ever done in my entire life is driving training. So it's fun to be able to learn to drive your platform to its limits, understand and practice on somebody else's platform. That's always good too. But just learning about what a vehicle can do is tremendously important, and what it can't do. And then if there's a time when you really need to use that vehicle, you're probably going to be more inclined to know what it's capable of.
That sounds very much like, 1 second there. Sorry, someone just tried to call me. But that sounds very much like my experience with swimming, where my mother was phobic level afraid of me drowning. So I took my first swim lesson. I knew how to swim before I started remembering things. And, I've kept myself in, knowing, swim a mile under, in ocean, lake, whatever, just as kind of a baseline. And then I trained for a triathlon and took a swimming lesson with a real swimmer and realized I had no idea how to swim. I'd been doing it all wrong. And I had that same experience the first time I took a defensive driving course, that I knew much less than I thought I knew. And it made a huge difference.
And again, the value, when you talk about the risk involved in driving with everybody else around you, so a lot of variables. I apologize, there's a lot more going by.
No worries.
So the risk involved with so many other variables being all these other cars, depending on where you live, the value of said product, like cars are expensive, so I'd like to keep mine not smashed up, and how much of our day-to-day lives we spend in a car. To me, there's a lot of value in pursuing that driver training. And there's variations of that as well. So I'll talk about a couple there. So you could do, as I mentioned, kind of a 1-day defensive driving course. where you're probably not going to be smacking up cars. They're going to keep it pretty safe. You're going to go out with the driver to instructor ratio is probably going to be pretty low. And then you can go to the next level up, which is kind of like a high-speed driver training or an evasive driving course or something along those lines. And generally those are for people that are going to be in harm's way of some sort. And from there, you're going to get into where you're going to learn pitting and ramming and driving through ambushes and things like that. Those are, follow-up courses. To me, the funnest courses, quite frankly, are the off-road courses, because you get to navigate technical terrain and learn about vehicle recovery. And so that to me translates quite well, one, into my lifestyle, because I do a lot of overlanding, but also just for the average person out there who can't change a tire, who can't doesn't understand basic things that would help them, as opposed to their car being on an axle on the side of the highway. It seems like to me like that those kinds of skill sets would be useful throughout everybody's lives.
And as you say, fun. It is fun to drive the ways you're not allowed to under normal circumstances.
Well, I mean, nobody's looking, you know what I'm saying?
Yes, indeed. Yeah, but you get to during the course, right? And it's
exactly.
totally legal and totally safe.
Yeah. And there's a couple schools here that I've been through that I can recommend. So most of these are back east in the Virginia area, but Academy, they have a great track, great instructors, both off-road and a flat track. I went to an ITI course. I don't know if they're offering training anymore. There's another school, ORT. BSR, Summit Racing over on the East Coast is really, really good. You have AS3, you have VDI. There's a go-kart one, or not, it's not go-karts like go-karts, but it's or go rally is what it's called, go rally. So that's more the autocross style where you're on multiple surfaces more often. So there's a lot of schools. I would try and find one that offers a one-day class, get some basic training in it, up to 3 to 5 day classes. And they are a lot of fun, and as I said, very relevant.
Very cool. And then after driving, almost kind of going to the opposite end of the spectrum, you mentioned primitive survival.
Yeah. So when I mean primitive survival, it's one thing to watch like Naked and Afraid, and you're trying to do that. There is primitive survival. And yes, those skills need to be there. But I think when I said it, I probably should have been a bit more clear in that, there's a lot of homesteading skills. So we have primitive survival, how to start a fire, those kinds of things, make a fish net, set a snare, those kinds of things. But if we come up a level from that, it's kind of things that have gone generationally away from us. So unless you're truly doing some kind of homesteading, those kinds of skills are moving out of our society very quickly. So something like an example of doing your own canning, like that's a skill that not a lot of people do unless they're in this kind of lifestyle. And it may pay dividends in the future, as long as you got enough seals and jars, and depending on what kind of canning you're doing, like you can continue to preserve fruit for a long period of time. That would be important to me. I'd like to know how to do more of that.
Yeah, and even if the world doesn't end, if you have a hyperactive apple tree in the backyard, or your garden produced more than you expected, you don't waste the food.
That's right. Yeah, I'm always happy when I see at least even little steps to that. If I see somebody that's raising their own chickens, if I see somebody that's built a root cellar, all of those kinds of things that are at least, well, life's pretty good, but I'm doing something that's on my own. I'm using my hands to do skills, and I'm holding on just in case the lights do go out. And I think that those are important skills for everybody to at least pursue. There's the way that I started getting exposed to some of that was, I forgot the app, but there are certainly social media groups, things like that you can go check out, and they get together and they'll do like little seminars on how to do certain skills like this. So those are pretty easy to find.
And it seems to have had a bit of a resurgence in the last 3 or 4 years, where there's I guess a social movement that seems to be more involved in that. So the resources are pretty common. If you're in if you're in a metro area, you can find a group, and if you're not in a metro area, you probably have a neighbor who knows.
Yeah.
Just because
the last few years have been a little interesting. I think a lot of people are starting to say, what else do I need to figure out? How my life is not as stable as I thought it was, so the whole run on toilet paper will do that to people.
It will. And And so those homesteading skills, including, you mentioned very specifically the, canning and food preservation, so that
Yeah.
so that you can keep that. What are some of the other top level skills in that department that we should have on hand?
Yeah, so I mean, I think water procurement, that's another one. When I see people now, again, there are some crazy laws state to state of how much water you can gather or preserve, but those kinds of things, if you can have any kind of water runoff catchment system, I think those are tremendously important. Obviously, the food preservation, that's another one that we've talked about, not just the canning, but if you can learn to jerk or smoke, or again, as I said, as a root cellar, those are all things that are going to help if things get a little bit darker than they are now. Even if you're having brownouts or things like that, I think it's important to know how to build at least a rudimentary primitive shelter. Again, we're going kind of spanning between homesteading and truly primitive, but sharpening your own knives, that's a good one. Keeping your own edges. A lot of people have a nice knife and then the edge gets beat up and they don't know what to do with it. That's just one of those small primitive skills that kind of go along with the tools of the trade, as it were.
I'd also add in knowing enough about sanitation.
For sure.
Because when the lights go off, that can be a big deal really fast.
Yeah, I it's funny, I read a ton of dystopian fiction and we all love the movies, and everybody gets these like crazy ideas of how things are going to go. And I would have to argue that probably the biggest hiccup that we're going to have if there's going to be a long-term power outage is lack of water, lack of sanitation, and then the sicknesses like cholera and dysentery and those kinds of things. They're going to rear their ugly heads in a hurry. It's going to be problematic. So yes, agreed. Having some alternate ways for the sanitation, and that's a big one.
On the topic of dystopian fiction, my lovely and talented wife is a literary agent from Canada, and when we got married, I started reading a bunch of Canadian dystopian fiction.
Yeah.
American dystopian fiction spends a lot of time talking about guns. Canadian dystopian fiction is basically camping porn.
Okay. I didn't realize there was that cultural difference in the type of dystopian fiction. That's very interesting.
Yeah, I mean, it's a disease or the zombies, but they get so into their camping gear in those books.
That's funny. There's a little bit of area to go camp. That's what I'm noticing. Even here in Idaho, I grew up here part of my life. It was a lot easier to get away, and now I got to trek pretty far to actually get away from people. So which kind of lays some emphasis into some of these skill sets that we're talking about, because as the populations get more and more crowded, knowing how to navigate, knowing how to drive, having some of these skill sets behind you will complement and drive the train, as opposed to just buying a bunch of gear and hoping things work out. So
and we talked about that when you were on before, about having all the gear in the world is great, but not nearly as good as having some gear that you know how to use.
Yeah. Well, and the beauty of it, right? Like if you take somebody that's highly skilled, I mean, honestly, the less stuff that they need, right? I mean, it's nice to have, and if you're prepared, then you probably shouldn't have to do without. But there's something to be said about having a lot of training so that you don't have to buy all of the gear. It's amazing to me how many people have, and we'll talk this a little bit down in the self-defense side, but how many people have just safefuls of guns and tons of ammo, can't hit the broadside of the barn, can't employ their weapon system because they're just like, oh, training's so expensive. And I'm like, well, sell one of the $3,000 rifles that you have and put that towards some training. So
yeah, that's a big pet peeve of mine. One of my tests for people who start talking a little bit too much about their weapons or the martial arts training or the guns is ask them what brand their fire extinguisher is. And it's shocking how many people either don't have it or have never deployed it.
Yeah. Yeah, that's definitely, and it's funny too how many, like that one little singular thing, again, kind of like we were talking about the emphasis on driving, like just being able to stop fires is a big deal. Something I learned in the Navy is like, oh, not all fires are created equal, and if you don't know how to stop them, you're probably going to make things worse.
Yeah, like throw water on a grease fire, see how that works out. Yeah. And the next on the list was privacy. And that's a huge one that we miss a lot of stuff about.
Yeah, and I think this one falls into knowledge and skills. I think they're both there. So when I say privacy, I really wanted it to be broad, meaning I think we have to have a higher level of consciousness of our own our signature online, specifically social media, but also big data. You and I were talking about that a little bit. But privacy also goes to not, having an understanding of how vulnerable you are at your own house. So that means when we talk privacy in the physical world, how far out can you reach to be able to see your perimeter, and how close can people get to you to see? So if somebody has the ability to put their face in your window and watch you watch TV, you probably got some work to do on your outer perimeter, right? And that comes back to that privacy. And I mean, that's the tie to security as well. And I know that people have varying degrees of tolerance. Some people are just like, hey, they already know everything. I don't care. I'm going to say whatever. Well, maybe, but there also should at least be the knowledge to where if you wanted to have a private conversation with someone, you should be able to. So if things like VPNs and peer-to-peer encryption, like those kinds of things sound foreign to you, you should probably read up a little bit, get a little bit of understanding of how you can at least protect yourself online.
Yeah, I'm definitely one of those people that leans into privacy as long as we kind of talk about it in general terms. I feel about it kind of the same way I feel about driving a stick. It's kind of nice to have, but increasingly it's not realistically going to happen in daily life. But I draw a line between privacy about people knowing my business, and security, information that is important to keep safe, to keep my family safe. And those are they're kind of different things in some ways. And focusing on focus on the safety thing, I think, is where a lot of people fall down.
Yeah, I think it's a discussion to kind of pull back some layers of the onion, right? So I have a hard time separating privacy and security because of one that leads to the other. So I may be protecting some pertinent information, but other relevant information that someone either elicits from me, or there's somebody that can put information together. So I don't care if somebody knows I shop at Home Depot. I don't care if somebody knows I like a particular pizza shop. I do care that if they're using that pattern of life analysis to then know where I'm going to be next.
Yes.
Those kinds of things concern me, right? So that's from a physical standpoint or a digital standpoint. And again, how you live your life, I think there should be some fundamental things that protect your privacy, but also the knowledge that if you want to have a private online experience, right? Okay, so that's one piece. If I want to have a private digital conversation, I know how to accomplish that. If I want to have a private meeting that nobody followed me to in person, I want to know how to do that as well.
Yeah. And
so again,
and kind of like we were talking about with driving a stick, I can probably live the rest of my life without ever having to drive a stick, but I'm glad that I know how to if I am called upon to do so.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's the way I look at it. There's movies, the Jack Reacher series, with Tom Cruise, and they kind of have him like a off the grid, super private, everything. And there are people that live their lives like that. There's a couple podcasts and companies that help specifically with your own privacy and kind of getting off the net, as they say, or off the grid. And also talks a lot about open source intelligence. And the reason I like that is because that really sees how people are vulnerable in ways that they wouldn't think that they are. The searches that are attainable out there are crazy. So, but as you said, I don't want to live the Jack Reacher life, but I do want to know that if I had to, I can have a private conversation in person, have a private conversation online or in the digital spectrum, and also be able to surf the internet in some level of privacy as well. So things like Signal and Proton email, those are great things to have so that you can have some level of anonymity online.
And I think also when we talk about privacy in this century, we think about data privacy, about social media, about email, about electronic surveillance, big data, what Facebook knows we bought last week. But we also accidentally give away so much information in the real world, in the physical world. And I think parents need to understand a little bit about that too.
Yeah, yeah, we were talking about that, and I'll give my
Yeah.
example to let you give yours. But it's amazing to me how many people, when I lived down at Fort Bragg, these guys are these, the super ninjas, and yet on the back of their truck it shows, Special Forces, 7th Group, Airborne Qualified. But other side, it has what you were talking about earlier as far as identifiers.
Yeah.
What's your pet peeve?
Oh, just the little window decal with your
Yeah,
kid's name and their grade and their favorite sport.
yeah,
Or
yeah.
the one that gets me also is, and I have military in my family, very proud of them, but the proud wife of a deployed soldier.
Mm-hmm.
That's
Yeah.
like, hey, entire world, my husband's not home.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a challenge. Everybody
Yeah.
assumes their own risks and does
Yeah.
things that they feel are appropriate. But I agree with you. Giving that much information out, it's not necessarily the one piece. It's somebody that can put multiple pieces together to do you harm. And just because the average person doesn't think that way, there is an entire population of this planet that is looking at any and all ways to exploit you, to take advantage of you. So, the old adage, lead a horse to water, but you can't make them drink. You can tell people all of this, but they might think that, well, I hope nothing happens to me. Well, hope's not really a strategy, right? So just trying to get people to think about some things to, I don't want anybody to be paranoid, but I also would do anything to protect my own children. And so if I see it's something that could even possibly be thought of as a vulnerability, why not correct it? It's just that simple.
Yeah.
Like if my choices are stickers on my car or somebody potentially messing with my kids, I'm going to get rid of the stickers. That's just me.
Yeah. And I want to reiterate or call attention to something you mentioned that was real news to me the first time I was exposed to the idea about, it's not necessarily what's happening in this conversation or this social media post, but a little piece from this social media post and a little piece from over on Twitter, and then a third piece of information, and then bad guys who target you can put those together. And then they know all of your security questions for your banking.
Yeah, that's like the money piece is a big deal. Your online profiles, people doing nefarious things to you. But I think the concept that you're talking about, right? That elicitation, that pattern of life analysis, those are all the things that concern me, because again, it's not just that one little piece you leave out or leak out, right? One thing you willingly give up and you're like, hey, it's not a big deal. It's in conjunction with a lot of other things that can be problematic. And I'll tell a very quick story if you don't mind, right? So I'm single. I occasionally am on dating apps, and I've had people that I've matched with, and there'll be something in their profile that jumps out at me. Either they list the company they work at, or their name's unique paired with a neighborhood they have or something like that. And it's literally not being creepy. I want to be able to say, hey, listen, you may want to remove the company you work for because your first name is unique enough that on LinkedIn it tells you this, and then once I know your last name and then I search, here's, without spending a dime, here's all of these things that can come up. And some people, when I do that, they get a little offended, like, oh, well, who cares or whatever, like, why would you even look at those things? Realize I'm a protector, and I have been for my entire adult life. I'm trying to safeguard people. And other people are super excited, like, oh my God, I had no idea that you could even find those kinds of things from something so simple. I can't go through everybody's profiles, but things like if you're mentioning your online, if it's company you work for and your name, and you have anything of your physical address, and also when your upcoming vacations are, things like that, like all of those are pretty easy to sift through. And do your online presence harm, do your home harm, or do people you love harm? So just would like people to get a better handle on that.
Yeah, my first introduction to this was in the 2000s. I ran a martial arts school for a long time, and one of the moms, or one of my students, their mom talked to me about how the dad was non-custodial and an abductionist, and the degree of care she had to take with her online presence because the guy was actively looking for them.
Yeah.
And little things like, she came to me and said, I know, I don't want to be a pain in the butt, but never, ever, ever post a picture of my kid's belt test or a class with my kid in it.
Yeah.
And even those very small details, and she had to be so careful with things that seemed very innocuous outside of that idea of an active bad guy.
Yeah. Yeah. And I know we're talking quite a bit about, somebody like that who truly is nefarious and on that online piece. I can't help but avoid the physical world as well. I mean, there's plenty I've taught surveillance classes and people think that it's this big deal. I'm not trying to have people become this intelligence operative to go overseas, but if I can show people from a surveillance detection standpoint where a predator would be and where they can use certain mechanics just of the geography and then get to a point where they can decide either to go to the police station if they think they're being followed instead of going to their home. Like, I think that's something valuable for any person that is concerned about their own privacy and safety. Those are the kind of things that I think they should know. So I'm not, like I said, I'm not trying to have people running around like they're Jason Bourne, but there are pieces of that world that the average person should probably have an understanding of.
Absolutely. And it's one of those ironic things where we talk about not being paranoid, but having a certain baseline of that skills and awareness actually alleviates anxiety and makes you much more comfortable and confident it doesn't make you paranoid. It makes you less paranoid in an ironic kind of backwards way.
Yeah. Competence breeds confidence.
Yeah.
Right. So the better you are at some things and the more you know, and you say, okay, this is a potential threat. Well, I've done these things to mitigate that threat. All of a sudden you walk a little bit more confidently. You understand, like, hey, if something goes sideways, I have a plan. I have the appropriate equipment and training behind that. Makes your life a whole lot less anxious.
Yeah. And the next item on the list to build up on that is communications, which we talked a little bit about in our last talk, but is so important.
Yeah. I harp on the phone, but if your entire world revolves around your phone, and we make all these jokes like, I can't remember your wife's phone number, like those kinds of things because they've been in your phone for so long, that's a problem. I mean, it truly is, because as communication, whether it be there's just a snowstorm that's knocked out the phones, if there's some interference from the cell towers, that occasionally happens more and more, it seems like. Whatever your natural man-made disaster that comes up, we probably are going to do better as a tribe as opposed to as an individual, no matter what the dystopian fiction books with all the guns tell you.
Yeah.
So I would want communication, when I chalk that up, is one, if I am alone, how do I signal? And that might be through a couple different electronic means. It also might be with a small mirror. It might be with building a big signal fire, generating a ton of smoke so somebody can see where I am. So there's kind of ground to air signals, individual notifications for rescue. And then there's other pieces of the puzzle like, hey, I want to connect to make sure my family's okay. I want to make sure that if there's nonverbal pre-existing communications, meaning if my daughter comes home from school and sees that I'm not home yet, she already knows to go to X neighbor's house, right? And so I know if I come home, she's not there, she will be. That is a version of a communications plan with your neighbors and kids. It's just already laid out, no technology needed, right? So those are the kinds of things I'm talking about, just not counting on always being able to get a hold of your phone, that your phone will always work. If we can just work through a couple other solutions, I think those are positives. And so, if we can get some skill sets and working through that, having a phone tree, having paper copies of that phone tree, having a couple different platforms to get a hold of the people that we want to, those are important skill sets to have.
Absolutely. And something as simple as if there's a snow day in the middle of the school day and they have to close school early, knowing before the school calls you which parent's job it is to go get the kid, and little things like that. And that's very important. I think a lot of parents don't sit down and come up with those communication plans ahead of time, and they try to wing it, which will work at 90% of the time, but other 10% of the time, really, that sucks.
Yeah, I agree. I think there's if you look at all of these subjects, and in fact, you and I kind of had a conversation, a small, brief conversation about what to expose to people. And so from my perspective, it's not a matter of the topics. There's hardly any topics I don't want to talk to children or people about. But it is something to be said about how to broach that subject and how to work through it with them. Because I don't want to like freak my kids out, right? Like, hey, if the gunfire comes from over here, we're going to hard point here. That's not the conversation I'm having with my 8-year-old daughter. But there are ways to, my daughter's not 8, I'm just saying as a young kid, but there are ways to approach subjects that can get some buy-in, and it doesn't make it look like it's this, end of the world scenario. And again, I think if it is approached that way, then your children see confidence and competence in you as an adult, and there's a level of confidence that everything's going to be okay. So instead of just, they're there, put your head in the sand, nothing to see here. I want my children, I want people around me to understand that the sooner we can see something's wrong, the sooner we can be on the same page to fix it and work through those problem solvings. We all have a better chance of overcoming whatever that obstacle is. So that's why I would rather talk about the subjects than not, but it's about the approach on how to do so.
And I think also with our kids, our young kids, I think we do worry about exposing them to a concept that would frighten them. But honestly, if they're old enough to understand the conversation, they've probably thought of it already. And I think that it's much better for them to see, okay, well, my parents who are responsible for my safety have thought of this. They have a plan. They're involved me in that plan. I think that's a much better space to be in than to never have talked to your parents about the situation.
Yeah, I agree. I think this is somewhat related, but it goes back to specifically working with kids and training. So I work very hard with my kids on threat recognition and like what makes a bad guy, right? Or what are indicators that I would look at to say whether or not that's somebody that I would go talk to or not. And so it's a game. So please don't I don't want people freaking out, right? But I would tell my kids as kind of a joke, like men fall into people fall into two categories. Somebody either I'll wrestle with or somebody I'm just going to shoot. Right. And so it's kind of the joke, like, hey, if there's some big, giant, huge guy, I'm like, oh no, I'm not even fighting that guy. He's just getting shot. So it's tongue in cheek. But in that, between like my kids, I'm like, okay, what about that guy? And they'd be like, fight him. And I would say, okay, why? All right, well, shoot him. Well, why? Right. Like, so is it just, do you want to eliminate these things like just because a guy's big or a certain color or whatever, right? Like we don't want to have any of those. I want to look past those things. I want to see what the real details are to whether or not someone's going to be a risk. And I say all that to say, not that I want to go get into a fight or I'm even having my kids thinking they're going to get into fights. It's actually to recognize the lack of those, meaning if my children need something, stranger danger, as prolific as it is, isn't always a case. Your kids may have to talk to somebody. So I'm trying to train my kids to look at people that they may want to approach versus people they may not want to approach. So that's again where it goes back to like the context and how I'm going to present it to people to get some buy-in.
And having those conversations and training them when they're right with us, like you say, in the restaurant, who would you go to for help out of these people? And also it bears repeating because stranger danger did get so prolific that it was just such a terrible idea.
It really is.
The thing is that if a child needs help, they have to talk to a stranger, because if they were with somebody they knew, they wouldn't need help. They'd be getting help, and knowing which kind of adults to approach. And for anybody watching this who hasn't heard it, the best advice I've encountered is if your kid can't find their family, go to another family.
Yes.
An adult with children. Whether that's mom and kids, dad and kids, nanny and kids, an adult with children in their care is statistically the safest. The safest. And also they're the kind of person who's likely going to stop at very little to help a child in need. Because they want to.
So again, it falls back to that confidence that we were talking about, and having a level of confidence. Your kids have been briefed, they're talked to. Okay, we all are trying to set up our families for our own survival, our own successes. So if we are showing more and more that we're looking at contingencies, whether it be natural disasters. So for instance, in my home that we had in North Carolina, there was a difference between being under the stairs for a tornado and how that was outfitted, and then having the safe room off the master bedroom and how it was outfitted. And my kids were understood which room to go to and why, and what was available to them. at a pretty young age, right? Like, I mean, we want our kids to know what to do under duress, and it shouldn't be leave it up to the young child, pre-adolescent child to think, right? Like that's the age where we need to tell them and then continue to build upon that as they get older.
And build those skills and it won't quite become an automatic reflex, but something they can do without having, as you say, think about it in the middle of an emergency. Just, oh, I go there. It's programmed.
So, and as we talk about these subjects that we've lumped together today, again, there's different levels of fidelity through all of them. If your listeners can honestly go through that and say, oh yeah, I'm subject matter expert all the way down the line, boom, 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 boom. Well, come talk to me. I want to hang out, right? Like I like people that are competent. But I would imagine most of the listeners are going to look in there and go, yeah, there's a couple places that I could probably, touch my game up a little bit. So, and I think having those conversations, having that insightfulness to say where you really are, what you can do to improve your skills, and I think that will set your families up for much higher level odds of success.
Absolutely agree. And the last time on the list is self-defense as a skill set that we should have.
Yeah. So the self-defense piece, I want to start with basic fitness. I think like you just have to have a basic level of fitness before anything else. I know a lot of people, they're 350 pounds, they wheeze up 3 stairs and they're like, well, I got my Glock on me. And like, that's their only problem solving ability. And I just can't. I mean, there just has to be a level of fitness that you can go and pull your child off of the street. You can, be able to stop somebody that's trying to get their way from you, through you to your children. I mean, there's just a level of that I feel like most people have. So I would start there.
Yeah. My first, I've been training in martial arts for 38 years, but my first self-defense lesson was cross country in 4th grade. And I rely on that to this, that is my favorite form of self-defense to this day.
Yep.
Yeah.
The Nike retreat, like that's always, not always a good solution, but it is an option, right?
Yeah.
So, and then to more into your wheelhouse, right? There's a lot of good martial arts that are out there. I think that there's a lot of camaraderie to be gained from those, from most of them. I think there's a level of effectiveness between some compared to others. All I would ask in any of the martial skills is that, you train under somebody that's reputable and you try to look at things that are going to be complementary into what you want to do. If you've got somebody that's trying to teach you something and it says something else is just completely not worth it, never do it, and doesn't even give it a chance or doesn't know about it, that's probably a little bit telling, right? Like if they're like, never do BJJ, Krav Maga is all, and I'm just using these as examples, right? No skin in the game on any of them. But if that's the case, that I would question that. That's just me, right? Like I want to be well-rounded in all things and have an understanding of all things. And you can pick your disciplines, and I have my favorite that I would recommend. But whatever that is, just look at people that are going to try and make you well-rounded.
Yeah, the choice of particular martial art units training is not nearly as important as the choice of the instructor, and in its compatibility with, as you say, your needs, your physiology. Another thing I'd add is get training from a lot of people of different sizes. Because one of my pet peeves in the industry is how many 6-foot ex-linebacker cops are teaching women's self-defense, as though they have any idea how a woman's body is going to the self-defense situation for a portable sized human is.
I agree. That's something to always take into consideration, whether it be firearms. Everybody's like, hey, this is the best gun. Like, well, maybe for you because you're a gorilla, but what about somebody of smaller stature? What's going to be their best? So I think that you bring up a very valid point with that. And I think self-defense pushes itself out as well, right? Like if I say self-defense, I want to be in a good enough fitness level. I want to be good enough with no tools. I want to be good enough with some tools. And then I'm going to continue to push my perimeter out, right? And all of that self-defense that comes with that, meaning my car, my house, my property, right? I'm continuing to push those out. So I think that your closest proximity is best, because that's really last place. I mean, I personally love instructors like Craig Douglas and some of these other guys that work with multiple weapon systems inside of a phone booth kind of thing, right? Like very close contact, because I mean, at the end of the day, it is the most intimate, hardest one. You know, you're getting ambushed. You have no time to prep. You're behind. You're behind the power curve. So I would start there and then work my way out from there. So.
Yeah, and there are courses about that. I know a guy in Florida who teaches them where his is expensive, but they've got a warehouse somewhere and they'll build a mock-up of your bedroom and have you sit there and then put your weapon, if you have a weapon in your bedroom, you'll put it approximately where it is in your room. And then they'll have you hang out there, and sometime in the next 20 minutes they'll kick in the door, and you can go that deep with this training if you want.
Yeah, there's a lot. I mean, there's a lot of different ways to train. I would just ask people that, you know, there's the old adage that the pen is mightier than the sword. The time not to have that argument is when the guy's got the sword and you've got the pen. So I would just probably want to start looking at getting people's physical fitness better, you know, just walking, start carrying things instead of having your kids carry, you know, just anything you can do. And for me, I really like stuff that keeps me reasonably in shape. I say reasonably these days, but reasonably in shape, and I enjoy. So I love backpacking and hiking. So throwing a pack on my back and ruck marching is reasonably enjoyable, right? I mean, if it's just being out and about and getting some scenery, if it's going out and shooting and doing things that are a little bit more dynamic than just standing on the line flat range, if your ranges, you know, facilitate that. I just think there's a lot of ways to be active and continue to enjoy life and also do good for your family, who are the people you're charged to protect.
And kind of pinging back to some things you said earlier about competence breeding confidence. Having a skill set with self-defense and a level of fitness means you move with more confidence, meaning the bad guys, who are generally cowards and will choose the easiest target possible, will go bother somebody who looks like they're easier.
And I will ping on this. And so just for anybody, any of your readers, there's a book that I just finished called Mind of Violence. And it's a pretty fantastic book. I'd highly recommend it. But that's one of the pieces that he talks about. You know, there's that fake confidence, right? Like that, I'm gonna make myself a hard target. I'm gonna really look like a hard target. But true predators are gonna look at that and recognize that overcompensation. But that underlying confidence, because you do have capability, that's something that true bad guys recognize. They're gonna see it and go, yeah, that's not the guy to tangle with or woman to tangle with, right? And that can be dependent on your physical demeanor, how you're looking around, your situational awareness, all of those other things. Real bad guys are always perceiving the same things in others. So if you can have real confidence because of your capability, it'll go a long way from just dissuading any kind of confrontation in the first place.
Yeah, it's one of those ironies of self-defense training. The more you get, unless you're a violence professional, the less likely you are to ever have to call upon it.
Yeah, it's an odd thing. One of the paradigms.
Yeah. Well, that's the end of our list, Josh. Thank you so much for coming on today. I always appreciate your knowledge.
Yeah, it's always good discussions.
Before we go,
I was just gonna say, I hope people get something out of it. You know, I really do. I understand, like, we talk in some larger themes here and give small isolated incidents of examples. But anybody's got any questions, I'm always happy to share more. So if you get specifics, I'm happy to jump in and answer where I can.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you so much. I mean, this little list here, it's just 7 things, but you know, self-defense is one that you kind of, it's a more instinctable skill. So it's something that we should be doing pretty much all the time. But the other 6, if you spent 2 months in the next year on each of them, a year from now, your family would be a very, very solid ground.
Yeah. And I think that, you know, that list is broken up in a way where you can hit little pieces of it and incrementally raise your overall bar. Right?
Yeah. Outstanding. Well, is there anything that we didn't talk about that you want to tack on before we wrap up today?
Well, I think that's a pretty good list. I think that, you know, there's always going to be more good conversations to have. We'll save it for the next time.
Outstanding. Sounds good. Thank you so much, Josh.
Hey, thank you.
Take care. And we're clear. Thank you again, man. I'm really glad we managed to get this done.
Yeah, is it okay? I mean, are you okay
it's
from
perfect.
content, noise level? I don't know what you're used to or what you're expecting. So I just get on here
we
and
don't
suck a bit.
Yeah. No, did you just say run my suck?
Yeah. You never heard that before?
I've never heard that. It's amazing. I have a new term.
Must be a military thing. It's pretty prolific throughout the military.
Military vulgarity. There should be linguists who study military vulgarity because it is so deeply creative and awesome.
It is. Yeah. I'm always very happy whenever I can go. What are we talking? We were about just at an hour, 55 minutes, whatever it is. Yeah. Super happy if I don't drop any F-bombs or say anything really outlandish as it relates to, because it happens. It happens occasionally.
Yeah. No, that's my attitude on the show is, I try to keep it PG-13, one F-bomb per episode. But, the way I see it, if you're a parent, you've cleaned up enough shit that you should be able to hear the word shit.
Yeah.
And the way that a babies happen means you should be okay with the word fuck.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you should have a pretty good baseline in both shit and fuck.
Yes. Exactly.
I like it.
All right. Well, thanks so much, man. Have a great day.
No problem, man. Take it easy.
Take care. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Today's episode was brought to you by our heroes over at Patreon. Todd Elner, Beth Edwards, Douglas Sedevy, Hugh O'Donnell, Art Brick, American Institutes of Kenpo, Beth Pratt, Richard Hubbard, Wayfinder Advantage, Kit Bradley, Lee Douglas, Amy Rivers, Neil Fastine, Kate Carlson, Brom Payton, Jenny Coakley, and Chris Jordan. Join the illustrious heroes by backing us at patreon.com/safestfamily. If you can't, that's okay, but do consider liking us and subscribing here on YouTube or sharing your favorite episodes on social media. Even a little bit on your end can make a lot of difference here. Thank you for watching today. Stay safe. We'll see you next time.